The snow had begun to fall, a gentle dusting that blanketed the sleepy countryside in white. Ryan trudged along the dirt road leading to his cabin, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn jacket. Each exhale puffed out invisible clouds, dissipating quickly in the cold air. The weight of the day pressed heavily on his shoulders, but it was a weight he had grown used to carrying. Life had been quiet since he'd lost her, quiet in a way that suffocated. The stillness of his cabin, once a haven, had turned into an unbearable echo of what was no longer there. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of wind against the windows reminded him of the laughter that used to fill the space, the warmth that had been stolen away too soon. Ryan didn't cry anymore. He'd done enough of that in the months after her passing. Now he moved through life like a man in a dream, not quite awake, not entirely asleep. The days blurred together, and the nights were endless stretches of staring at the ceiling, wishing for anything to break the monotony of his grief. That was when Nilo appeared. It was early spring, and the days were just beginning to grow longer. Ryan had been out back, chopping wood for the stove, when he noticed the dog. He was nothing more than a shadow at first, lurking just beyond the tree line. Thin, skittish, and covered in mud, the animal had watched him with wary eyes, ready to bolt at the slightest movement. Ryan didn't try to approach him. He'd seen enough strays in his time to know that trust wasn't easily given. Instead, he left a small bowl of food at the edge of the clearing and went back inside, watching from the window as the dog crept closer. It took 3 days before the dog finally ate in front of him, and another week before he allowed Ryan to touch him. Naming him was the easiest part. Nilo had a wildness about him, a strength that reminded Ryan of the river that ran behind the cabin. He was a survivor, just like the water that carved its path through the land, no matter the obstacles in its way. In the months that followed, Ryan and Nilo became inseparable. The dog was a balm to his aching soul, a presence that didn't demand anything from him but companionship. Together they carved out a new routine. Ryan would work on his carpentry during the day, and Nilo would lay nearby, his tail wagging lazily whenever Ryan glanced his way. At night, the dog would curl up at the foot of Ryan's bed, his soft snores filling the room with a comforting rhythm. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel so oppressive. But life, Ryan knew, had a way of pulling the rug out from under you just when you started to find your footing again. The notice came in the middle of summer, a crisp white envelope tucked into the mailbox at the end of the drive. Ryan had opened it casually, expecting nothing more than a flyer or a bill, but the words printed inside hit him like a punch to the gut. The land had been sold. He had 30 days to vacate the property. Panic set in quickly, followed by a simmering anger that refused to be ignored. This cabin wasn't just a house to him. It was his history, his sanctuary. It was where he'd built a life with her, where they dreamed of growing old together. And now, it was being taken away by strangers who saw it as nothing more than a plot of land for their next project. Ryan spent hours on the phone, trying to fight the decision, but it was no use. The sale was final, and the new owners had no intention of renegotiating. With no other options, he began packing up his life, piece by piece. Nilo didn't understand what was happening, but he could sense the shift in Ryan's mood. The dog followed him everywhere, his eyes filled with concern. It was as though he was afraid that if he let Ryan out of his sight, he might disappear too. When the final day arrived, Ryan loaded the last of his belongings into his truck and took one last look at the cabin. The walls that had once held so much joy now felt like a prison he was finally being released from. Still, as he drove away, a part of him stayed behind, lingering in the memories he couldn't bring himself to leave entirely. The weeks that followed were a blur of cheap motels and endless job applications. Ryan tried to keep his spirits up for Nilo's sake, but the strain was beginning to show. His savings were dwindling, and the prospect of finding a new place to call home seemed more and more like a distant dream. Then, one day, Nilo disappeared. Ryan had left him in the backyard of a friend's house while he attended an interview. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best he could do under the circumstances. When he returned, the gate was ajar, and Nilo was nowhere to be found. Panic surged through him like a tidal wave. He spent hours calling the dog's name, driving up and down the streets, asking anyone he saw if they'd noticed a golden-haired mutt wandering by. The days turned into weeks, and Ryan refused to give up. Nilo was more than a pet to him. He was family. He was the one thing in Ryan's life that still felt solid, real. Losing him wasn't an option. Finally, a call came in from a local shelter. They'd found a dog matching Nilo's description near the outskirts of town, but there was a catch. He was being held at an animal control facility as part of an ongoing investigation. Ryan's relief quickly turned to frustration when he learned the details. Nilo had been found on the developer's property, and Ryan's own actions, trespassing, to look for him, had complicated the situation. Now, standing in the courtroom, Ryan felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. The loss of the cabin, the endless uncertainty, the thought of never seeing Nilo again. It was almost too much to bear. When he made his final request to see his dog, he didn't expect the judge to agree. But the moment Nilo bounded through the courtroom doors, everything else faded away. The dog's joy was infectious, his wagging tail a blur of motion as he leapt into Ryan's arms. For the first time in months, Ryan felt like he could breathe again. He didn't care about the stares from the people in the courtroom or the murmurs that filled the air. All that mattered was Nilo, safe and alive, licking his face as if they'd never been apart. As he held his dog close, Ryan silently vowed never to let anything come between them again. No matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them, together. And for the first time in a long time, Ryan allowed himself to hope. As Ryan stepped out of the courthouse, the crisp winter air hit his face, but it didn't bother him. In his arms was Nilo, his tail wagging like a metronome of pure joy. Ryan inhaled deeply, as if he could draw strength from the cold air around him. This wasn't just a new chapter. It felt like the first clean page in a long time. The events of the day swirled in his mind. The judge's decision had been unexpected, almost miraculous. For weeks, the weight of potential imprisonment had loomed over him, threatening to crush what little hope he had left. But now, walking out of that courthouse with Nilo nestled close, he felt as though he'd been given a second chance. "Let's go home, buddy," Ryan whispered, though the word home felt strange on his tongue. He didn't have a home, not in the way he used to. The cabin had been his sanctuary, a place of love and memories. Now, it was nothing more than a construction site waiting to be razed to the ground. The two of them climbed into Ryan's old pickup truck. The engine sputtered, before roaring to life, and the familiar rumble seemed to settle something in his chest. Nilo sat beside him, his head resting on Ryan's lap, as if he understood that they were finally free. "Things are going to get better," Ryan said, more to himself than to the dog. He reached down, scratching behind Nilo's ears. "They have to." They drove aimlessly for a while, the radio humming softly in the background. The idea of going back to the cheap motel he'd been staying in felt unbearable. The walls there were thin, and the bed was stiff. It was no place for Nilo. Not after everything he'd been through. Ryan's thoughts drifted to the judge's words. "Find stability, for both your sakes." It was easier said than done. His savings were nearly gone, and steady work had been hard to come by. He couldn't help but feel like a man who had been tossed into the middle of a storm, struggling to keep. His head above water, Nilo let out a soft whine, pulling Ryan from his thoughts. "Hungry, huh?" he asked, glancing down at the dog. Nilo's ears perked up, and his tail thumped against the seat. Ryan pulled into the parking lot of a small diner on the edge of town. The neon sign flickered, casting a pale glow over the empty lot. He parked the truck and turned to Nilo, "Stay here, buddy. I'll be quick." Nilo's eyes followed him as he stepped out of the truck, but he stayed obediently in his seat. Inside the diner, the smell of fried food and freshly brewed coffee filled the air. Ryan ordered a sandwich and a small burger for Nilo, paying with the last few bills in his wallet. As he waited for his food, he couldn't help but notice the waitress watching him. "You look like you've had a rough day," she said, her voice kind but matter-of-fact. Ryan offered a small smile. "You could say that." "Traveling with your dog?" she asked, nodding toward the truck where Nilo's silhouette was visible in the window. "Something like that," Ryan replied. The waitress didn't press further, and when his food was ready, she added an extra cup of coffee to his order. "On the house," she said with a wink. "Thank you," Ryan said, genuinely touched by the small act of kindness. Back in the truck, Ryan unwrapped the burger and handed it to Nilo, who devoured it with gusto. The sight of the dog eating so happily brought a smile to Ryan's face, one that felt more genuine than any smile he'd managed in months. As they sat there, eating in the dim glow of the parking lot lights, Ryan began to think about their next steps. The motel was a temporary solution, but they needed something better, somewhere they could truly start over. "I've been thinking," Ryan said, breaking the comfortable silence. Nilo perked up, his ears twitching at the sound of his voice. "Maybe it's time we left this town. Start fresh somewhere new." The words hung in the air, carrying a mix of hope and uncertainty. Ryan wasn't sure where they would go or how they would get there, but the idea of leaving behind the painful memories of the past was tempting. The next morning, Ryan woke early, the first rays of sunlight creeping through the thin curtains of the motel room. Nilo was already awake, sitting by the door as if he knew something was about to change. "All right, buddy," Ryan said, stretching and rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Let's hit the road." They packed up quickly, and soon they were back in the truck, the engine humming as they headed toward the highway. Ryan didn't have a clear destination in mind, but he figured they'd know it when they found it. As they drove, the scenery shifted from snow-covered fields to dense forests, the winding roads offering a sense of escape. Ryan felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: freedom. Nilo seemed to sense it too. He stuck his head out the window, his fur ruffling in the wind as he barked happily at passing cars. For the first time in months, the weight on Ryan's chest began to lift. After hours of driving, they arrived in a small, picturesque town nestled in a valley. The streets were lined with charming shops and cozy-looking houses, their rooftops dusted with snow. A sign at the entrance of the town read, "Welcome to Meadowbrook." Ryan pulled into a small park on the edge of town and stepped out of the truck. The crisp air filled his lungs as he took in the peaceful surroundings. Nilo leapt out after him, his tail wagging as he sniffed eagerly at the ground. "This could be it," Ryan said, more to himself than to Nilo. The town had a warmth to it, a sense of community that he hadn't felt in a long time. As they wandered through the park, Ryan noticed a man walking toward them with a leash in one hand and a cheerful golden retriever trotting by his side. "Nice dog you've got there," the man said, his voice friendly. "Thanks," Ryan replied, patting Nilo on the head. The two dogs sniffed each other cautiously before breaking into playful barks, their tails wagging furiously. "Name's Caleb," the man said, extending a hand. "Ryan," he replied, shaking it. "You just passing through?" Caleb asked. "Thinking about staying, actually," Ryan admitted. "Well, Meadowbrook's always got room for one more," Caleb said with a grin. "And if you're looking for work, the hardware store downtown is hiring. The owner's a good guy. Might be worth checking out." Ryan nodded, a spark of hope igniting in his chest. "Thanks. I'll look into it." Over the next few days, Ryan began to settle into the rhythm of the small town. He visited the hardware store and was offered a part-time job on the spot. The work was straightforward but satisfying, and it gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He found a small rental cabin on the outskirts of town, a modest place with just enough room for him and Nilo. It wasn't much, but it was warm and safe. and for the first time in a long time, it felt like home. Nilo thrived in their new surroundings. He spent his days exploring the nearby woods, chasing squirrels and rolling in the snow. His joy was infectious, and Ryan couldn't help but feel like they'd finally found the fresh start they'd been searching for. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Ryan stroked Nilo's fur and whispered, "We made it, buddy. We're going to be okay." Nilo looked up at him, his eyes filled with a love so pure it made Ryan's throat tighten. For the first time in years, Ryan felt whole again. He didn't know what the future held, but with Nilo by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. The winter melted slowly into spring, and the little town of Meadowbrook awakened with bursts of color. Blossoms painted the trees, and the grass grew thick and green. Ryan found himself smiling more often, his steps lighter as the days passed. Life here felt simpler, freer, and full of small joys he had forgotten existed. Work at the hardware store had become a steady part of his routine. The owner, Mr. Linton, was a kind older man with a quick wit and a fondness for Nilo. More than once, Ryan would glance out the store's window to see Nilo lounging on the front porch, basking in the sun as townsfolk stopped to pet him. "Best mascot I've ever had," Mr. Linton joked one day as he rang up a customer. "You're lucky, Ryan. That dog's got a charm about him." Ryan nodded, looking over at Nilo through the window. "He's saved me more times than I can count." It wasn't just the store that brought Ryan into the fold of Meadowbrook's community. Caleb, the man he'd met in the park, introduced him to others around town. A weekly potluck at the community center became a tradition, and soon Ryan found himself surrounded by new friends who welcomed him without hesitation. But for Ryan, the best part of Meadowbrook was the way it gave Nilo room to thrive. The dog's boundless energy found its outlet in the vast fields and woods that surrounded their small cabin. Every morning, Ryan would lace up his boots and grab Nilo's leash. Not that Nilo needed it. The dog had a knack for staying close, even when his curiosity led him bounding through the trees. One morning, just as the sun was beginning to peek over the horizon, Ryan and Nilo set out on their usual hike. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers. Birds sang from the treetops, their melodies weaving together in a chorus that seemed to celebrate the new day. Ryan had always loved these quiet moments. They gave him a chance to think, to reflect on how far he'd come since leaving behind the life that had once felt so permanent. As they reached a clearing, Nilo froze, his ears perking up. "What is it, boy?" Ryan asked, following the dog's gaze. Ahead of them, a deer stood at the edge of the trees, its delicate frame bathed in golden light. It was a beautiful, fleeting moment, one that felt almost too perfect to be real. Nilo tilted his head but made no move to chase the animal. He seemed content to simply watch, as if understanding that this was a scene to be admired, not disturbed. When the deer finally disappeared into the woods, Ryan crouched down and scratched Nilo behind the ears. "You're something special. You know that?" Nilo leaned into the touch, his tail wagging softly. As the weeks turned into months, Ryan began to feel something he hadn't in a long time. Peace. The weight that had once pressed so heavily on his chest had lifted, replaced by a quiet contentment. He still thought about the past, the cabin, the life he'd shared with her, but the memories no longer felt like a burden. They were a part of him, just as Meadowbrook was becoming a part of him now. One evening, as they sat outside the cabin, the stars scattered across the sky like diamonds, Ryan found himself talking to Nilo, as he often did. "You know, I never thought we'd find a place like this," he said, his voice soft. "After everything we went through, I wasn't sure if I even deserved it." Nilo rested his head on Ryan's knee, his eyes full of quiet understanding. "But you," Ryan continued, his throat tightening, "you kept me going. You reminded Me that there's always something worth holding on to. The dog's tail thumped against the porch and Ryan chuckled, his eyes glistening. Yeah, you're my anchor, buddy. My family. One afternoon, as Ryan was restocking shelves at the hardware store, Mr. Linton approached him with a knowing smile. You ever think about expanding that carpentry work of yours? The older man asked. Ryan looked up, surprised. What do you mean? There's a workshop space in the back that's been gathering dust for years, Mr. Linton explained. You've got a talent for building things, Ryan. Why not put it to good use? Ryan hesitated. He hadn't thought about carpentry as anything more than a hobby since leaving his old life behind. But the idea of creating something again, of crafting pieces that could bring joy to others, sparked a small flame inside him. I'll think about it, he said, though he already knew the answer. Over the next few weeks, Ryan transformed the dusty workshop into a place of creativity and purpose. He spent hours sanding, cutting, and shaping wood, his hands moving with a confidence he hadn't felt in years. Nilo was his constant companion, lying at his feet as he worked, occasionally lifting his head to watch with curious eyes. Word of Ryan's craftsmanship spread quickly through Meadowbrook. Neighbors began stopping by to request custom pieces, tables, chairs, even intricate carvings. Ryan poured himself into each project, finding a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known he needed. One day, as he finished sanding the final edge of a rocking chair, he glanced over at Nilo. The dog was watching him intently, his tail wagging as if in approval. What do you think? Ryan asked, holding up the chair. Nilo barked, his enthusiasm filling the small workshop. Yeah, Ryan said with a smile. I think it's pretty good too. By the time autumn arrived, Ryan's life had transformed in ways he never could have imagined. He was no longer the man who had stumbled into Meadowbrook, broken and uncertain. He was part of the community, now a neighbor, a craftsman, a friend. And through it all, Nilo had been by his side, a constant source of strength and love. The bond between them had deepened in ways that words could never fully capture. One crisp autumn evening, as they walked along the edge of the woods, Ryan looked down at his loyal companion and said, You know, Nilo, I think we finally found our place in the world. Nilo looked up at him, his eyes shining with the kind of trust and devotion that only a dog could give. And for the first time in a long time, Ryan believed it. They were home. Together. The days grew shorter as winter returned to Meadowbrook, wrapping the town in its familiar quiet. Snow blanketed the rooftops and dusted the streets, muffling every sound and turning the little valley into a storybook scene. Ryan watched the flakes fall from the cabin window, sipping a mug of steaming coffee. At his feet, Nilo stretched lazily, his tail thumping softly against the floorboards. The year had passed in a way Ryan never thought possible, full of meaning, peace, and the kind of joy that didn't need to shout to be heard. He had carved out a life for himself here, and it was all because of Nilo. His dog had been the one constant through it all, the one who had never doubted him, even when Ryan doubted himself. Looks like it's going to be a long winter, Ryan said, reaching down to scratch behind Nilo's ears. But I think we can handle it. Nilo tilted his head in response, his eyes filled with the kind of love that only deepened with time. Later that day, Ryan and Nilo ventured into town. The streets were alive with the warmth of the holiday season. Strings of lights hung from storefronts, and the scent of pine and cinnamon filled the air. Children laughed as they built snowmen in the park, their cheeks red from the cold. Ryan waved at Caleb, who was hanging a wreath on the door of his shop. "Ryan!" Caleb called out, his voice carrying through the crisp air. "You coming to the tree lighting tonight?" "I wouldn't miss it," Ryan replied, his breath visible in the frosty air. The town square had become one of Ryan's favorite places, especially during the holidays. It reminded him that life could be simple and good, even after everything. he had been through. That evening, the town gathered beneath the massive pine tree in the square. It stood tall and proud, its branches adorned with ornaments made by the community. Children's laughter echoed as they played in the snow, and neighbors huddled together with cups of hot cocoa. Rian stood near the back, Nilo by his side, watching as the mayor began the countdown to light the tree. When the lights flickered on, illuminating the square in a soft golden glow, a collective cheer rose from the crowd. In that moment, Ryan felt something he hadn't in a very long time: complete. Not the fleeting kind of happiness that came from distractions, but the deep, lasting peace of knowing he was exactly where he was meant to be. As the festivities continued, Caleb approached Ryan with a wide grin. "You're not thinking of skipping the potluck tomorrow, are you?" "Wouldn't dream of it," Ryan said, laughing. "Good. We're counting on you to bring one of those pies you've been bragging about," Caleb teased. "I think you've got me confused with someone else," Ryan replied, shaking his head. "I'm not much of a baker." "Maybe not, but you've got the spirit," Caleb said, clapping him on the back. Ryan smiled, glancing down at Nilo, who was busy charming a group of children by rolling over in the snow. "We'll be there." The next day, Ryan and Nilo spent the morning preparing for the potluck. Though Ryan had no plans to bake a pie, he did put together a hearty stew that he knew would warm everyone on such a cold night. The cabin was filled with the rich aroma of simmering vegetables and spices, and Nilo watched him intently, hoping for a taste. By the time they arrived at the community center, the potluck was already in full swing. Long tables were lined with dishes of every kind, and the room buzzed with laughter and conversation. Ryan set his pot of stew on the table, earning a grateful nod from Mrs. Linton, who seemed to be orchestrating the entire event. "Ryan," she exclaimed, "I was hoping you'd bring something. And look at Nilo. Doesn't he look dashing?" Nilo wagged his tail as Mrs. Linton crouched down to scratch his head. She'd tied a small red bandana around his neck, calling it his holiday best. The evening passed in a blur of laughter and connection. Ryan found himself at ease among the people who had become like family to him. Caleb's daughter dragged him into a lively card game, and Nilo basked in the attention of every child who crossed his path. As the night wound down, Ryan stood near the doorway, watching the room with a quiet smile. Nilo sat beside him, leaning against his leg. "Happy boy?" Ryan asked, looking down at the dog who had been his anchor through every storm. Nilo barked softly, his tail wagging, and Ryan chuckled. In the weeks that followed, Ryan's workshop became busier than ever. Orders poured in from all over town, and he found himself making everything from custom furniture to intricate holiday decorations. The work gave him purpose, and every piece he finished felt like a small triumph. One day, as he was putting the finishing touches on a hand-carved bench, a knock came at the workshop door. Ryan opened it to find Caleb standing there, holding a flyer. "Thought you might be interested in this," Caleb said, handing it over. Ryan unfolded the paper, reading. The bold text at the top: "Meadowbrook Winter Market, calling all artisans." "They're looking for local craftsmen to set up booths," Caleb explained. "I figured your work would be a hit." Ryan hesitated, glancing at the pieces scattered around the workshop. He'd never considered showcasing his work in such a public way. "You've got a gift, Ryan," Caleb said, sensing his hesitation. "People deserve to see it." After a moment, Ryan nodded. "All right, I'll give it a shot." The winter market turned out to be a turning point for Ryan. His booth, filled with hand-carved ornaments and furniture, drew attention from nearly everyone who passed by. People marveled at his craftsmanship, and by the end of the day, nearly every piece had sold. It wasn't just the success of the market that stayed with Ryan, it was the sense of belonging. For the first time, he felt like he was truly part of Meadowbrook, not just as a resident, but as someone who contributed to its heartbeat. On a quiet evening, as Ryan and Nilo sat by the fire, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. The hardships, the heartache, the uncertainty, it had all led to this moment. "You know," he said, looking at Nilo, "if someone had told me a year ago that we'd end up here, I wouldn't have believed them." Nilo tilted his head, his eyes filled with that unwavering trust. "But we made it, didn't we?" Rian continued, his voice soft. "Together." The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. Nilo stretched out, resting his head on Ryan's lap, and in that moment, Ryan felt something he hadn't dared to hope for in a long time. Contentment. They had found their place in the world, a home filled with love, community, and the promise of brighter days ahead. And as long as they had each other, Ryan knew they could face anything that came their way. The past was behind them, the future wide open, and the present was perfect.